Do not call me handsome if you ain't gonna hand me some of that badonkadonk.
Today, South Carolina Department of Corrections employees came together to remember their co-workers. Police say 25-year-old Winter Straw died when she was shot during a domestic dispute outside an apartment on Mallet Hill Road. The Department of Corrections says Straw worked as a mental health officer at the Broad River Correctional Institute. Straw's funeral was today at Second Nazareth Baptist Church.
On March 26, 2023, in Columbia, 25-year-old Winter Nicole Straw was found fatally shot outside her apartment, marking conclusion of what authorities would later classify as a domestic violence homicide. The suspected gunman, Renardo S. Johnson, died shortly after from a self-inflicted gunshot wound following a barricaded standoff. What initially appeared to be a sudden act of violence would later reveal a sequence of overlooked warning signs, misread relationship dynamics, and critical timeline gaps. Investigators were forced to reconstruct the final hours using fragmented witness statements, digital traces, and behavioral patterns that had gone unnoticed. The absence of a traditional trial left the case without courtroom scrutiny, shifting the burden to forensic interpretation and circumstantial reconstruction. As details emerged, earlier assumptions were challenged, exposing how quickly a private conflict escalated into a fatal outcome with irreversible consequences. Every case starts with evidence and works toward the truth. We rely on verified facts, documented timelines, and official records, not speculation or sensationalism. Subscribe to stay updated as we examine each case clearly, carefully, and professionally. The case involving Winter Nicole Straw concluded without a courtroom proceeding. Law enforcement classified the incident as a murder-suicide, identifying Renardo S. Johnson as the individual responsible for the fatal shooting before taking his own life. This determination was based entirely on investigative findings rather than judicial process. Because the suspect died at the scene, there was no opportunity for formal prosecution, cross-examination, or adversarial review of the evidence. The absence of a trial meant that conclusions drawn by investigators were not tested in court, leaving certain aspects of the case reliant on interpretation rather than legal validation. The official ruling rested on the totality of evidence collected, physical, circumstantial, and testimonial. Authorities concluded that the sequence of events was linear and self-contained, with no indication of external involvement. However, the lack of judicial scrutiny introduced a structural limitation. Without defense challenges or forensic rebuttal, investigative conclusions remained uncontested. This type of case resolution places emphasis on reconstruction rather than litigation. The verdict becomes an administrative closure rather than a legal judgment, and the narrative is shaped solely by the evidence available at the time. In this instance, investigators determined that the fatal encounter stemmed from a domestic dispute that escalated rapidly, ending in 2 deaths within the same location. The conclusion reached by investigators was supported by a combination of forensic findings, timeline reconstruction, and behavioral analysis. Ballistic examination confirmed that the victim sustained gunshot wounds fired at close range, indicating a direct and intentional act rather than a distant or random shooting. The trajectory and proximity of the shots aligned with a face-to-face confrontation, reinforcing the theory of a targeted incident. Scene analysis established that Winter Nicole Straw was located outside her apartment at the time she was shot. There were no indicators suggesting movement across multiple locations, which helped narrow the timeline and define the scene as a primary point of contact. The timeline began with 911 calls reporting gunfire during the early evening hours. These calls provided the first external markers of the incident. Deputies responded promptly and discovered the victim unresponsive at the scene. Emergency assessment confirmed that she had sustained fatal injuries. Attention then shifted to the suspect. Renardo S. Johnson was located inside the apartment, where he had barricaded himself following the shooting. This created a contained environment that limited immediate access for investigators and delayed evidence collection. During the standoff, law enforcement maintained perimeter control while attempting to resolve the situation. The sequence ended when the suspect sustained a self-inflicted gunshot wound, confirming his death. This progression, initial shooting, barricade, and subsequent suicide, formed a continuous chain of events. The absence of interruption or third-party interaction reinforced the conclusion that the homicide and suicide were directly connected. No conflicting ballistic evidence, additional suspects, or alternative timelines emerged. As a result, investigators determined that the evidence collectively supported a single offender scenario with a definitive sequence. The transition from an active investigation to a defined case occurred rapidly. The key breakthrough was the identification of the suspect as someone known to the victim. Witnesses at or near the apartment complex reported seeing Renardo S. Johnson in proximity to Winter Nicole Straw shortly before the shooting. These accounts established immediate linkage between the two individuals at the critical moment. Further investigation confirmed that they were involved in a romantic relationship and that there had been a recent dispute. This contextual information shifted the case from a general violent incident to a domestic conflict scenario. The decisive moment came when law enforcement confirmed that the suspect was inside the apartment during the barricade situation, directly tying him to the scene both before and after the shooting. This eliminated uncertainty about his presence and involvement. Simultaneously, investigators found no evidence of forced entry, additional suspects, or external threats. The absence of these factors narrowed the scope of the investigation significantly. Within hours, the case moved from an open-ended homicide to a domestic violence-related fatality. This shift was driven by the convergence of witness testimony, relationship history, and real-time situational evidence. The speed of this breakthrough reduced the need for prolonged suspect identification efforts, but also limited opportunities to explore alternative angles that might have required more time to develop. At the initial stage, responding officers considered multiple possible explanations for the shooting. One early theory was that the incident could have been a random act of violence, given the outdoor location and sudden nature of the gunfire. Another possibility was robbery-related violence, which is often associated with shootings occurring near residential complexes. However, these theories were quickly undermined by the evidence. There were no signs of forced entry, no reports of stolen property, and no indications of an attempted theft. The victim's belongings remained intact, and the scene did not reflect the disorganization typically associated with robbery. Additionally, the rapid identification of a known associate, Renardo S. Johnson, contradicted the idea of an unknown assailant. His presence at the scene, combined with the barricade, provided a direct line of inquiry that displaced earlier assumptions. These initial theories also underestimated the intensity of the relationship conflict. At first glance, there were no public indicators suggesting that the situation would escalate to lethal violence. This gap between perception and reality contributed to the early misdirection. The correction of these theories occurred quickly, but it highlights a recurring investigative pattern. Early-stage assumptions often rely on generalized crime patterns rather than case-specific evidence. In this instance, those assumptions were replaced by a more focused understanding once direct connections between the victim and suspect were established. The primary crime scene was located outside the apartment complex in Columbia, South Carolina, where Winter Nicole Straw was found. Upon arrival, deputies observed that the victim had sustained fatal gunshot wounds. The positioning of the body and the distribution of evidence suggested that the shooting occurred at that exact location, rather than elsewhere. There were no signs of a prolonged physical struggle. This absence indicated that the confrontation was brief and likely escalated quickly. The evidence pointed toward a direct interaction between the victim and the shooter, rather than an extended altercation. The nature of the scene suggested a targeted encounter. The victim was not caught in crossfire, nor was there evidence of multiple shooters. The ballistic pattern and lack of collateral damage reinforced conclusion that the act was deliberate and focused. The situation inside the apartment added complexity. The suspect's decision to barricade himself created a secondary scene that remained inaccessible during the initial phase of the investigation. This delay affected immediate recovery of potential evidence, access to firearms used in the incident, retrieval of digital devices that could provide context. As a result, investigators had to rely initially on external observations and witness statements while awaiting resolution of the standoff. Once access was granted, the interior scene became critical in confirming the sequence of events, particularly regarding the suspect's final actions. In the final hours leading up to her death on March 26, 2023, Winter Nicole Straw was confirmed to be at or near her apartment residence in Columbia, South Carolina. The available timeline, reconstructed through witness statements, dispatch logs, and responding officer reports, places her within the immediate vicinity of her residence shortly before gunfire was reported. There is no indication that she had traveled elsewhere in the critical window preceding the incident. This consistency in location allowed investigators to narrow their reconstruction to a confined geographic area, reducing variables related to movement and external contact. The absence of travel or unrelated activity suggests that the events unfolded within a familiar and predictable environment. Witness accounts indicate that a verbal dispute occurred shortly before the shooting. While the exact content of the exchange remains undocumented, multiple reports confirm the presence of raised voices and an escalating argument. The timing of this dispute in direct proximity to the gunfire establishes a clear sequence: confrontation followed by immediate violence. Investigators noted that the progression from verbal disagreement to fatal gunfire occurred within a compressed time frame. There is no evidence of prolonged interaction, negotiation, or de-escalation efforts. The rapid transition indicates a situation that had already reached a critical threshold prior to the recorded confrontation. The timing and circumstances suggest that the encounter was not accidental. The presence of both individuals at the same location, combined with the escalation pattern, supports the conclusion that the meeting was either planned or anticipated, whether prearranged or expected based on prior communication. The interaction was not random. Another critical observation is the absence of any confirmed attempt by the victim to flee or seek assistance. There were no emergency calls placed by her, no recorded attempts to leave the scene, and no indications of defensive movement beyond the immediate location. This suggests one of two possibilities. Either the escalation occurred too quickly for a response, or the perceived level of threat was not recognized until it was too late to act. This phase of the case is defined by its brevity. Within a short sequence of events, presence, dispute, gunfire, the outcome was determined. The lack of interruption or intervention during this window remains a central point in the reconstruction of the incident. At the time of her death, Winter Nicole Straw was 25 years old. She was employed as a mental health officer with the South Carolina Department of Corrections, a role that required structured training in behavioral observation, emotional regulation, and the identification of psychological instability. Her professional responsibilities included monitoring individuals with varying degrees of mental health conditions, assessing behavioral changes, and responding to signs of distress or escalation. This background is relevant because it indicates a level of familiarity with conflict recognition and behavioral warning signs. From an external perspective, there were no widely reported concerns about her personal life. Public perception of her relationship, as reflected through social media and general observation, suggested stability. There were no overt indicators of distress, conflict, or instability visible through publicly accessible channels. This contrast between professional expertise and personal circumstances introduces a critical analytical point. While she was trained to identify behavioral risks in a controlled environment, those same dynamics may not have been as clearly defined or recognizable within a personal relationship context. There is no evidence to suggest that her professional role directly influenced the events leading to her death. However, her background provides context for understanding how the situation may have been perceived or misperceived prior to escalation. Her daily routine, based on available information, followed a structured pattern consistent with full-time employment. There were no indications of irregular behavior, sudden disruptions, or significant life changes in the period immediately preceding the incident. Overall, her background presents a profile of stability, routine, and professional responsibility. This baseline is important because it contrasts with the sudden and unanticipated nature of the incident, reinforcing a lack of visible warning signs prior to the event. One of the most significant aspects of the case is the absence of publicly documented prior reports of domestic violence. According to statements from family members and available records, there were no formal complaints, police reports, or legal actions indicating a history of abuse or threats within the relationship. This lack of documentation initially framed the case as an isolated incident rather than the culmination of an ongoing pattern. However, investigative hindsight suggests that the absence of formal reports does not necessarily equate to the absence of underlying issues. Potential overlooked indicators include escalating interpersonal conflict. While not formally recorded, it is possible that disagreements, tension, or instability existed within the relationship but were not communicated to external parties or authorities. Another factor is emotional dependency or imbalance. Relationships characterized by uneven emotional investment, control dynamics, or unresolved conflict can create conditions for escalation. These factors are often subtle and may not be recognized as warning signs until after a critical incident occurs. The investigative process often relies on documented evidence, reports, complaints, prior incidents to establish patterns. In this case, the lack of such documentation limited the ability to identify risk factors in advance. It also constrained the post-incident analysis, as there were fewer reference points to examine behavioral progression. This gap highlights a recurring issue in domestic-related cases. Private relationship dynamics frequently remain undocumented until after a significant event. Without external reporting or intervention, patterns of conflict may remain internal and unexamined. In retrospect, investigators must consider whether warning signs were present but unrecognized. These could include changes in communication patterns, behavioral shifts, or indirect indicators of within the relationship. However, without formal records, these elements remain speculative. The case underscores a limitation of relying solely on documented history to assess risk. It demonstrates how incidents can emerge without prior official indicators, complicating both prevention and investigation. Several critical questions remain unresolved due to the nature of the case and the absence of a trial. One primary question is whether earlier intervention could have prevented the escalation. Without documented reports or formal complaints, there was no clear trigger for law enforcement or external parties to intervene prior to the incident. However, this does not eliminate the possibility that informal warning signs existed. Another question concerns the potential for undocumented prior incidents. It is possible that previous conflicts, threats, or aggressive behavior occurred but were not reported. These incidents, if they existed, would provide important context for understanding progression toward violence. Digital communication is another area of interest. Text messages, call logs, and social media interactions often contain indicators of conflict, tension, or escalation. Whether such data contain warning signals, and whether those signals were recognized or acted upon, remains unclear. The role of social media perception also raises questions. Public portrayals of relationships often present a curated image that may not reflect underlying realities. In this case, the relationship appeared stable externally, which may have contributed to a lack of concern or scrutiny from others. The absence of a trial introduces additional limitations. Without courtroom proceedings, evidence is not subjected to cross-examination, and interpretations are not challenged through adversarial processes. This means that certain conclusions remain based on investigative findings rather than judicial determination. As a result, some aspects of the case remain interpretive. While the sequence of events is supported by evidence, the underlying motivations, prior dynamics, and potential warning signs are not definitively established. These unresolved elements are not uncommon in cases that conclude without trial. They reflect the boundaries of what can be determined through investigation alone, without the additional scrutiny of legal proceedings. This case demonstrates how a domestic dispute can transition rapidly into lethal violence within a confined time frame and familiar setting. The sequence of events, presence, confrontation, escalation, and outcome occurred without interruption, leaving limited opportunity for intervention. From an investigative standpoint, the case required reconstruction based on physical evidence, witness accounts, and behavioral inference. Without a surviving suspect to question or a trial to examine the evidence, the conclusions are derived from available data rather than contested testimony. The absence of documented prior incidents highlights a key challenge in similar cases. Risk factors may exist without formal recognition. This limits both preventive measures and post-incident analysis. Ultimately, the case is defined by its reliance on evidence rather than adjudication. The findings establish what occurred, but certain elements, particularly those related to intent, prior dynamics, and missed warning signs, remain unresolved. This reinforces a broader investigative reality. Not all cases reach a level of definitive closure. Some remain constructed from fragment of evidence, shaped by what can be proven rather than what may have existed beyond documentation. Facts verified. Case concluded. Justice is determined by what can be proven. Subscribe for more documented cases and real criminal investigations.